Edit, can you come get me? Naomi Brooks whispered into her trembling phone as the cracked screen reflected the harsh fluorescent light above her. The words barely escaped her lips before the call disconnected, leaving only the low electronic buzz of a dying battery and the distant hum of an expensive mansion settling into evening silence. She stared at the dark screen for a heartbeat, then slipped the phone into the pocket of her faded gray maid's uniform as though hiding the last fragile thread of hope she still possessed. The polished marble hallway stretched before her, gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm gold across the floor, while the faint scent of fresh lilies drifted from an arrangement she had replaced less than an hour earlier. Nothing about the mansion suggested anything was wrong. Every painting hung perfectly straight. Every silver frame reflected flawless order. Every expensive object whispered wealth. Only Naomi's slow footsteps disturbed the silence as she walked toward the service corridor, carrying an empty linen basket against her chest. She had worked in the Ashcroft estate for almost 3 years, long enough to memorize every staircase, every hidden pantry, every polished brass handle, and every quiet expectation that came with remaining invisible. She arrived before sunrise each morning, prepared breakfast before anyone woke, polished antique furniture until she could see her reflection in the dark wood, and left long after the final lights disappeared upstairs. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. She never interrupted conversations. She never complained when another shift stretched an hour longer than promised. At home, a small apartment across town waited with unopened bills stacked beside a second-hand coffee maker and framed photographs of her grandmother, the woman who had raised her with one simple rule. Dignity costs nothing. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. Naomi repeated those words every morning before leaving for work, smoothing the wrinkles from her uniform with careful hands before locking the apartment door behind her. That evening, however, even familiar routines felt strangely different. Conversations between household employees stopped whenever she entered a room. 2 co-workers exchanged quick glances before forcing polite smiles that vanished the moment she looked away. The air carried the sharp scent of floor polish mixed with fresh paint from a recently renovated guest wing, and somewhere above, muted laughter echoed through the ballroom where another private gathering had already begun. Naomi continued folding freshly pressed table linens inside the service room, carefully aligning every corner with practiced precision. A silver serving tray slipped from another employee's hands nearby, clattering loudly against the stone floor. Before anyone else reacted, Naomi quietly bent to help gather the scattered utensils. "Leave it," one voice said coldly. "You've got enough work already." She simply nodded, offered a gentle smile, and returned to stacking folded napkins without another word. 20 minutes later she carried a basket of clean towels toward the lower storage hallway, where motion-activated lights flickered on one section at a time, casting alternating bands of brightness and shadow across the polished concrete floor. The cool air smelled faintly of detergent and cedar shelves. Her footsteps slowed when she noticed the hallway unusually empty. She reached the laundry room door, balanced the basket against her hip, and instinctively touched the phone resting inside her pocket. One name remained saved in her contacts. She had never called it before. She did not even know whether the number still belonged to the man who had quietly placed it into her hand 8 years earlier with only one sentence. "If you ever truly need me, don't hesitate." Naomi had almost deleted it dozens of times. Somehow she never did. Upstairs, the grandfather clock struck 7 slow notes that echoed through the mansion. Naomi looked once more at the silent screen before sliding the phone back into her pocket. Exactly 17 minutes away, a black sedan rolled through downtown traffic carrying a man who had no idea his life was about to change forever. Naomi pushed the laundry cart through the narrow service corridor, its rubber wheels whispering across polished concrete while warm air from the boiler room mixed with the crisp scent of freshly pressed cotton. Every shelf stood perfectly organized because she had arranged them herself before dawn, folding towels into identical squares and labeling every storage bin with careful handwriting. The routine steadied her breathing. It always had. Whenever the mansion grew louder upstairs with expensive laughter and crystal glasses touching beneath golden chandeliers, Naomi escaped into the quiet rhythm of work. She carried stacks of clean linens to the guest suites, adjusted heavy velvet curtains until every fold hung perfectly straight, and paused only long enough to replace fading white roses with fresh blooms whose sweet fragrance softened the silence inside each room. The homeowners rarely noticed those details, but guests often complimented the elegance without ever knowing whose hands had created it. Naomi never expected recognition. She simply believed that every task deserved the same care whether someone noticed or not. Late that evening, the house manager handed her another list of assignments while several other employees quietly clocked out for the night. "The East Wing still needs attention," he said without looking up from his clipboard. Naomi accepted the papers with both hands and nodded politely before wheeling her cart toward the private hallway. No complaint crossed her face even though the digital clock above the security office already read 7:08 p.m. Her grandmother's small silver watch rested loosely around her wrist, its scratched glass catching the hallway lights each time she lifted another stack of folded sheets. The old watch had stopped working years ago, yet Naomi still wore it every day because removing it somehow felt like leaving home behind. As she entered the East Wing, the thick carpet muted every footstep until only the distant hum of the central air system remained. Soft amber wall sconces illuminated expensive paintings while the faint aroma of polished walnut drifted through the corridor. She finished changing bed linens inside the final guest room, carefully smoothing every corner before lifting the empty laundry basket again. When she returned to the service elevator, she discovered it had been locked for maintenance without warning. The only route back to the lower level required taking the long staircase behind the ballroom, adding nearly 5 extra minutes to her trip. Naomi quietly adjusted the basket against her hip and started walking without hesitation. Downstairs, another employee accidentally knocked over a container of glass candle holders near the catering entrance. Several pieces rolled beneath storage shelves. Before anyone asked, Naomi set her basket aside, knelt on the cool tile floor, and gathered each unbroken holder one by one, wiping away dust with the corner of her apron before placing them safely into a cardboard box. "You didn't have to do that," the younger employee murmured awkwardly. Naomi smiled gently. "We'll both finish sooner now." She returned to the hallway carrying the empty basket once again, unaware that the simple delay had shifted every minute of the evening. At exactly 7:13 p.m., the phone hidden inside her pocket vibrated once. The screen remained black from its exhausted battery, but the vibration came from the emergency power reserve activating for a final incoming message. Naomi borrowed a charger from the security desk, waited just long enough for the screen to glow faintly, and unlocked it. Only 4 words appeared beneath an unfamiliar location pin. "Stay where you are." There was no signature, no explanation, and no second message. Naomi stared at the screen as the battery indicator blinked at 1% before shutting off forever. At that same moment, less than 12 miles away, Kong Minho looked at the dashboard clock inside his black sedan, leaned slightly toward his driver, and gave a single calm instruction that changed the pace of everything. 7 minutes left. Don't slow down. Naomi slipped the powerless phone back into her apron pocket and tightened her grip on the empty laundry basket before continuing down the service hallway. The polished floor reflected pale strips of fluorescent light while the quiet mechanical hum of the ventilation system echoed through the lower level of the mansion. Every instinct urged her to keep moving. The brief message had not answered any questions, yet it carried a certainty she could not explain. "Stay where you are." She reached the central laundry room, placed the basket neatly beside the folding table, and instead of beginning another task, calmly removed her name badge from the clipboard listing unfinished assignments. For the first time since accepting the job, she decided not to volunteer for another extra shift. She walked toward the employee lounge, filled a small paper cup with cool water from the dispenser, and sat beside the narrow window overlooking the rear driveway. Outside, decorative lanterns cast soft amber circles across the stone path while the scent of trimmed hedges drifted through the slightly open glass. Upstairs, the evening reception continued with distant piano music and the muted clink of crystal glasses. Downstairs, time seemed to slow. A supervisor entered the lounge carrying a stack of schedules and frowned when he saw Naomi sitting instead of working. "There's still plenty left to finish," he said sharply. Naomi stood respectfully. I completed everything assigned to me. He glanced at the clipboard, then toward the hallway. The ballroom storage room still needs organizing. Naomi looked at the clock mounted above the vending machine. The second hand swept steadily toward another minute. I'll take care of it tomorrow morning, she answered quietly. The supervisor stared at her as though hearing a completely different person. She had never declined a request before. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. That's not how we do things here. Naomi met his eyes without raising hers. Tonight, I need to stay here. The silence between them stretched longer than either expected. The supervisor finally shook his head in disbelief and walked away, muttering that someone else would finish the work. Naomi released a slow breath and returned to the chair beside the window. The decision had changed something inside the mansion. For the first time, she had chosen her own judgment instead of everyone else's expectations. Across the city, the dashboard clock inside the black sedan changed from 7:15 to 7:16 p.m. Streetlights flashed rhythmically across Kong Minho's face as the vehicle moved smoothly through evening traffic. The rich scent of leather filled the quiet cabin. A navigation display counted down the remaining distance in bright blue numbers. His phone rested on the seat beside him, still displaying the single missed call that had lasted only a few seconds before ending. He had memorized the trembling voice immediately. 8 years had changed many things, but not that voice. His driver glanced briefly into the rearview mirror. 2 minutes. Kong answered with one calm nod. Front entrance. No delay. The convoy turned through the wrought iron gates of the Ashcroft estate, tires whispering over the circular stone driveway. Security personnel straightened instinctively as the lead sedan rolled beneath the entrance canopy. Inside the employee lounge, Naomi heard an unfamiliar sound drifting through the building. It was not the piano from upstairs or the service elevator descending. It was the low synchronized rumble of several engines coming to a stop directly outside the mansion. She slowly rose from her chair and looked through the narrow window just as the headlights of a line of black vehicles washed across the marble entrance in clean white light. The grandfather clock in the main hall began striking the quarter hour. The 17th minute had arrived. The deep rumble of idling engines rolled through the marble entrance hall before anyone reached the front doors. Conversations inside the ballroom faded one by one as guests turned toward the sound, crystal glasses suspended halfway to their lips while warm chandelier light shimmered across polished floors. Through the tall windows, a line of black sedans stood perfectly still beneath the entrance canopy, their headlights casting long white reflections across the stone driveway. Naomi stepped quietly from the employee corridor into the rear of the foyer, her gray maid's uniform still dusted with faint traces of fresh linen fibers, one hand resting lightly against the strap of her apron. She did not move closer. She simply watched. The massive oak doors opened with a slow, deliberate sweep, allowing cool evening air scented with trimmed hedges and damp stone to drift inside. Kong Minho entered without hurry, dressed in a tailored black suit untouched by the rush of the journey that had brought him there. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble, each measured step louder than the whispered conversations surrounding him. Several members of the household staff instinctively stepped aside. Even the homeowners paused mid-sentence, uncertain why such an influential visitor had arrived without warning. Kong acknowledged no one. His eyes traveled calmly through the foyer until they found Naomi standing near the service hallway beneath a brass wall sconce whose warm light framed the tired lines of her face. She had not changed as much as time should have allowed. She still stood with straight shoulders. She still folded her hands neatly before her whenever she waited. The only difference was the hesitation in her breathing as she realized the man walking toward her had truly come. He stopped only a few feet away. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The distant piano upstairs continued playing, softened by thick carpets and closed doors, while somewhere in the kitchen a timer chimed and faded into silence. Kong looked at her with the same steady composure that had carried him through boardrooms and negotiations across continents. "You stayed exactly where I asked," he said quietly. Naomi gave a small nod. "I wasn't sure if the message was really from you." A faint smile crossed his face. You called. That was enough. Around them, puzzled glances multiplied. One of the homeowners stepped forward with a practiced smile, extending a hand in welcome. Mr. Kong, this is certainly unexpected. If we'd known you were coming, Kong politely inclined his head but did not accept the interruption. I'm here for Miss Brooks. The simple sentence settled over the foyer with remarkable weight. Naomi looked down instinctively, then back toward him. You didn't have to leave everything for me, she said softly. You once told me to call only if I truly needed you, Kong replied. You called. No one in the room could mistake the certainty in his voice. The supervisor who had insisted Naomi continue working only minutes earlier shifted uncomfortably beside the staircase, his clipboard lowering inch by inch. Kong finally turned toward the gathered household, his expression remaining calm, his tone respectful. Her shift is over. It was not spoken as an argument or a request. It sounded like a simple fact that no one present found the confidence to dispute. Naomi slowly removed the folded assignment sheet from her apron pocket and placed it on the nearest side table beside a vase of white orchids. The paper made the faintest whisper against polished wood. Without another word, she untied the apron strings behind her back, folded the fabric into a careful square, and laid it beside the unfinished schedule. Then she looked up at Kong. I'm ready to leave. He offered a single nod before turning toward the open doors. Together they took the first steps across the marble foyer, and behind them the balance of power inside the mansion shifted without anyone raising a voice. The cool night air wrapped gently around Naomi as she stepped through the open front doors, the faint fragrance of cedar hedges mixing with the clean scent of rain lingering on the stone driveway. Behind her, the mansion remained unusually silent. No one called her name. No one asked her to stay. The convoy of black sedans waited with headlights glowing softly against the circular entrance, their engines idling with a low, steady vibration that seemed to calm the hurried rhythm of the evening. Kong Minho stopped beside the rear passenger door and waited until Naomi approached. He did not rush her. He simply held the door open as though the choice still belonged entirely to her. Naomi looked back once at the mansion where she had spent countless mornings polishing silver, arranging flowers, and quietly disappearing into the background of other people's lives. Warm light spilled from the ballroom windows, carrying distant laughter and the faint sound of a string quartet drifting into the evening. Then she turned away and entered the car without another glance. The leather seat felt cool beneath her hands, and the quiet click of the closing door separated her from the estate more completely than any words ever could. As the convoy pulled away, city lights reflected across the tinted windows in long ribbons of gold and white. Neither of them spoke during the first few miles. The only sounds inside the cabin were the muted hum of the tires and the soft whisper of the climate system circulating warm air. Kong finally reached into the center console, removed a bottle of water, and offered it to Naomi. She accepted it with both hands, taking a slow sip before placing it carefully beside her. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. Kong looked ahead through the windshield. You called. There was nowhere else I was supposed to be. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, tracing the faint stitching along the leather seat with her fingertips. I almost deleted your number so many times. A small smile crossed Kang's face. I'm glad you never did. Another brief silence settled comfortably between them. It no longer felt heavy. It simply allowed the city to pass outside while the distance between the mansion and the convoy quietly grew. After several minutes, Naomi turned toward him. You arrived in exactly 17 minutes. Kong nodded once. I promised myself years ago that if your name ever appeared on my phone, every other appointment would end immediately. Naomi looked at him with quiet surprise. You remembered me for that long? He answered without hesitation. Some debts should never become old enough to forget. The convoy turned onto a quieter boulevard lined with oak trees whose branches swayed gently beneath streetlights. Kong pressed a small button beside his seat, and the privacy partition silently rose between the driver and the rear cabin. He folded his hands together for a moment before speaking again, his voice remaining calm and measured. 8 years ago, you helped someone you believed was a complete stranger. You didn't ask his name. You didn't ask whether he deserved your kindness. You simply helped. Naomi searched his face, slowly recognizing details that time had softened but never erased. The thoughtful eyes. The quiet way he chose every word. The slight scar near his left eyebrow. Memory returned not as a dramatic revelation but as a gentle certainty. She remembered a young Korean traveler stranded beside a roadside with a damaged rental car, rain soaking through his jacket while everyone else drove past. She had shared her umbrella, bought him hot coffee from a gas station, and refused the cash he tried to offer before he handed her a small card with a phone number written neatly across the back. Kong watched understanding settle into her expression before quietly finishing the sentence she had never expected to hear. I've been hoping for 8 years that you would never have to use that number. Now that you have, I'm not letting you face another difficult day alone. The convoy left the city lights behind and entered a quiet private estate where tall pine trees lined a winding driveway illuminated by soft lanterns set into natural stone. The tires rolled slowly across pale gravel, producing a gentle crunch that blended with the distant sound of water flowing through a narrow stream beside the road. Naomi watched the lights of the mansion ahead come into view, not grand in the way the Ashcroft estate had been, but calm, balanced, and welcoming. Warm amber light glowed through wide windows, and the faint scent of cedar drifted in through the slightly lowered window as the sedan came to a smooth stop beneath a covered entrance. Before anyone reached for the door, Kong stepped out first and quietly opened it for her. Naomi hesitated only a moment before placing her feet onto the polished stone. The evening air felt cooler now, carrying the fragrance of fresh tea leaves from a nearby garden. Inside, the house was remarkably quiet. No hurried footsteps echoed through the halls. No raised voices traveled from distant rooms. A single grandfather clock ticked steadily near the entrance while a fireplace cast soft orange light across walnut floors. Kong removed his suit jacket and draped it over the back of a chair before leading Naomi toward a small dining room where a simple meal had already been prepared. Warm rice, vegetable soup, grilled salmon, and fresh fruit rested on the table beneath gentle pendant lights. Nothing appeared extravagant. Everything appeared thoughtful. Naomi looked at the meal, then at Kong. You didn't have to prepare all of this. He poured hot tea into 2 porcelain cups, steam curling gently into the quiet room. You haven't eaten since this morning. Naomi smiled faintly because he was right. She had been too busy working to notice the hours passing. They sat across from one another, sharing the meal without unnecessary conversation. The only sounds came from silverware touching ceramic plates and the quiet crackle of burning oak logs in the fireplace. Halfway through dinner, Naomi carefully folded her napkin and looked toward him. You still haven't asked why I called. Kong rested his teacup on its saucer with deliberate care. Because you wanted someone to come. She looked down at her hands. The small silver watch still circled her wrist, its frozen hands forever pointing to an hour long forgotten. I almost convinced myself not to call anyone. Kong answered gently. But you did. Another silence settled comfortably between them before Naomi reached into her apron pocket and slowly removed the folded employee badge she had forgotten to leave behind. She placed it on the table beside her untouched teacup. The plastic card reflected the warm light for a moment before coming to rest. I'm not going back, she said quietly. Kong looked at the badge, then back at her. He did not congratulate her. He did not persuade her. He simply nodded once, accepting the decision as though it had always belonged to her alone. Then tomorrow begins somewhere else. Naomi released a slow breath she had been carrying for much longer than a single evening. She reached for the teacup again, warming her hands against the smooth porcelain while the scent of jasmine rose gently between them. For the first time in years, there was nowhere she needed to rush. No unfinished list waited in another hallway. No bell demanded another task. The quiet itself felt unfamiliar. A discreet knock interrupted the peaceful silence. One of Kang's senior aides stepped respectfully into the room carrying a slim leather folder. Sir, he said calmly, the Ashcroft family has requested an immediate meeting. They insist on speaking with both of you tonight. Kong closed the folder without opening it, stood from the table, and looked toward Naomi. This time, he said evenly, they'll come to us. The meeting room overlooked a quiet reflecting pond where soft lantern light shimmered across perfectly still water, yet inside the house every sound carried unusual clarity. The ticking grandfather clock echoed through polished walnut walls, porcelain teacups rested untouched on a low cedar table, and the faint aroma of jasmine lingered in the warm air. Naomi remained seated with both hands gently wrapped around her cup while Kong stood beside the tall window, watching the headlights of approaching vehicles glide slowly through the entrance gates. Minutes later, the Ashcroft family's black SUV rolled to a stop beneath the covered driveway. They had arrived without the confidence they carried inside their own mansion. The difference was immediately visible. There were no raised voices, no hurried commands to employees, and no carefully rehearsed smiles. A member of Kang's staff quietly welcomed them before escorting them into the reception room. As the homeowners entered, their polished shoes made soft taps across the wooden floor before falling completely silent. They looked first at Kong, then at Naomi, who remained calmly seated exactly where she was. For the first time since she had begun working for them, no one expected her to stand when they entered the room. Kong gestured politely toward the empty chairs across the table. Please. Everyone sat. Warm tea was poured into simple porcelain cups, steam rising slowly beneath the golden light overhead. Kong waited until every cup rested quietly on its saucer before speaking. You asked for this meeting. The owner cleared his throat. Miss Brooks has always been one of our most dependable employees. We would like to resolve today's misunderstanding and invite her to return. Naomi listened without interrupting. Her fingers rested lightly against the smooth ceramic cup while the small silver watch remained visible beneath the sleeve of her cardigan. She had spent years believing she needed permission to speak. Tonight, she quietly discovered she no longer did. Before Kong answered, he turned slightly toward her. The decision is yours. Naomi looked across the table. The familiar faces no longer seemed larger than life beneath expensive clothing and practiced authority. They simply looked like people waiting for an answer. She carefully placed her teacup onto its saucer, the gentle porcelain click becoming the only sound in the room. I appreciate the opportunity you gave me, she said calmly. But I won't be returning. No anger entered her voice. No accusation followed. She simply spoke with quiet certainty. The words settled over the room with more weight than any argument could have carried. The homeowners exchanged uncertain glances before one of them leaned forward. If this is about compensation, we're prepared to discuss improvements. Naomi slowly shook her head. This isn't about salary. She paused briefly, looking toward the window where pine branches moved gently beneath the evening breeze. It's about waking up every morning knowing I don't have to leave my dignity at the front door. Silence followed. Even the fire in the nearby hearth seemed quieter. Kong remained where he stood, saying nothing. He did not answer for her. He did not strengthen her words. She no longer needed anyone to speak on her behalf. After several moments, the owner lowered his eyes and gave a slow nod. We understand. It was the first honest sentence spoken since the meeting began. The conversation ended without negotiation. The visitors quietly stood, thanked Kong for receiving them, and walked toward the entrance. As the front door closed behind them, the sound echoed softly through the peaceful house before disappearing into the night. Kong turned back toward Naomi, his expression calm but unmistakably respectful. 8 years ago, he said quietly, you helped a stranger without expecting anything in return. Tonight you reminded everyone in this room that dignity cannot be offered as a reward after it has been overlooked. Naomi looked at the folded employee badge still resting on the table beside her empty teacup. She picked it up one final time, held it for a brief moment beneath the warm light, then placed it gently into the fireplace where the plastic slowly curled and disappeared into glowing embers. She never looked back. Morning arrived quietly, carrying the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee through the cedar-paneled kitchen while pale sunlight filtered across polished hardwood floors in long golden ribbons. Naomi stood beside the wide farmhouse sink wearing a simple cream-colored sweater borrowed from the guest wardrobe, gently washing a porcelain teacup before setting it carefully onto a drying cloth. The rhythm of ordinary life felt unfamiliar after years spent measuring every minute against someone else's schedule. Outside the tall windows, dew shimmered across trimmed gardens, and a pair of songbirds settled briefly on the stone fountain before lifting into the clear blue sky. A house attendant approached with a small envelope resting on a silver tray. "Mr. Kong asked me to give this to you after breakfast." Naomi accepted it with both hands, opening the cream-colored paper slowly. Inside was a single sheet with only one sentence written in neat black ink. "Meet me in the East Garden when you're ready. No time. No pressure. Just an invitation." Naomi folded the note, slipped it into her pocket, and walked through the quiet house until she reached the garden path. Smooth flagstones wound between flowering magnolias whose sweet fragrance lingered gently in the cool air. Kong waited beside a koi pond, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as he scattered small handfuls of fish food across the water. Circular ripples spread quietly beneath the morning light. He turned when he heard her footsteps but said nothing until she reached him. "You slept?" he asked. Naomi smiled softly. "All night." He nodded as though that answer mattered more than anything else. They walked together beneath rows of maple trees where sunlight flickered through green leaves, creating shifting patterns across the stone path. Neither hurried to fill the silence. It no longer needed filling. Eventually Kong stopped beside a wooden bench overlooking the pond and handed Naomi a slim folder. She opened it carefully. Inside were documents establishing a community hospitality foundation dedicated to providing employment and professional training for people rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. The final page remained unsigned. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked quietly. Kong looked toward the water where bright orange koi glided beneath floating lily pads. "Because it was always missing someone who understands dignity better than management." Naomi looked up, surprised. He met her eyes with the same calm certainty that had carried him across the city 17 minutes after her call. "I'm asking you to lead it." She immediately shook her head with a gentle laugh. "I've only ever been a maid." Kong answered without hesitation. "You've been someone who made every place better simply by caring for the people inside it." Naomi lowered her gaze to the unsigned papers. The thick linen pages felt smooth beneath her fingertips. She thought of folded towels, polished silver, fresh flowers, and every quiet task she had once believed invisible. None of those years suddenly seemed wasted anymore. They had prepared her for something larger than survival. She picked up the fountain pen resting inside the folder, paused only long enough to read the final line once more, and signed her name with steady hands. Kong closed the folder gently and smiled, not with triumph but with quiet respect. "Welcome home, Naomi." She looked across the peaceful garden, breathing in the scent of blooming jasmine carried by the light breeze, then extended her hand toward him. Kong accepted it without ceremony. In that simple handshake, no debt remained, no rescue was owed, and no promise was unfinished. The woman who had once whispered a desperate call for help now stood on her own feet, choosing her own future, while the man who arrived exactly 17 minutes after hearing her voice quietly kept the only promise that had ever mattered. Edit a year later, the foundation opened its third hospitality training center inside a renovated brick building overlooking a quiet public square where children chased pigeons beneath old oak trees and the aroma of fresh bread drifted from neighborhood cafes each morning. Sunlight poured through wide windows onto polished wooden floors, illuminating classrooms where former housekeepers, hotel attendants, and service workers practiced new skills with quiet confidence. On one wall hung a simple bronze plaque engraved with 8 words, "Dignity should never depend on someone's job title." Naomi paused before unlocking the front doors each morning, running her fingertips lightly across the cool metal before welcoming another group of students. She no longer wore a maid's uniform. Instead, she chose simple professional clothing that reflected the same quiet grace she had always carried. Nothing about her kindness had changed. Only the direction of it had. She greeted every new trainee personally, remembered their names after a single introduction, and quietly noticed the people standing alone before anyone else did. Kong often arrived early with coffee from the small bakery across the street, placing warm paper cups on the conference table before the staff meeting began. He never announced his arrival. He simply became part of the routine that everyone trusted. The foundation flourished not because of wealth alone, but because every decision reflected the same promise that had changed 2 lives on one unforgettable evening. No one who entered the program was treated as invisible. One autumn afternoon, a young housekeeper sat alone outside the building, staring at a cracked phone with uncertain hands. Naomi stepped onto the stone steps carrying 2 cups of hot tea, offering one without asking questions. The steam curled gently into the cool air while fallen maple leaves drifted across the sidewalk. The young woman looked up with tired eyes. "I didn't think anyone would come for me," she whispered. Naomi smiled softly and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Sometimes the hardest part is believing you're allowed to ask." Across the square, Kong watched quietly from beside his car, the same calm expression resting on his face as the day he crossed the city without hesitation. He had built companies, negotiated impossible agreements, and earned the respect of powerful people, yet the accomplishment that mattered most to him had begun with a phone call lasting only a few trembling seconds. Later that evening, after the final trainees had gone home, Naomi and Kong walked through the peaceful garden behind the center where lanterns reflected across a narrow pond and the fragrance of jasmine returned with the cooling air. The small silver watch still rested on Naomi's wrist, its hands forever frozen, not because she needed to remember a difficult past, but because it reminded her that even when time seems to stop, hope can still arrive. Kong glanced toward the watch and smiled. "Have you ever thought about repairing it?" Naomi looked down at the scratched crystal, then gently shook her head. "No." "Why not?" She reached for his hand as they continued along the stone path, warm light falling across the water beside them. "Because I already know the only minute that changed my life." Kong understood without another word. Exactly 17 minutes after hearing the quietest call for help, he had kept a promise to come, but what truly rescued Naomi was not the distance he crossed, nor the power he carried, but the simple certainty that when she finally whispered, "Can you come get me?" someone answered, someone came, and from that moment forward, she never again had to wonder whether her dignity was worth showing up for.